Kia ora, welcome to Women Power. Amanda Tofale was 33 when her ex-partner stabbed her 17 times, slit her throat and left her to bleed to death. He'd earlier broken into her home with keys he had copied and had concealed himself in the roof. He used a drill and screws to create a makeshift strap to lower himself down later. He hid up there for 8 hours until Amanda and her children were in bed. After killing her, he spread her blood around the spare room to make it look as though a stranger had broken in. Ernest Smith was last week sentenced to at least 17 years jail for murder. This week, we're talking about domestic violence. Almost 90,000 domestic violence investigations were carried out in the year ending June 2013. In 40,000 of those cases, charges were laid, and 113,000 children were recorded as being present or normally resident. Why do so many men beat the woman they're in intimate relationships with, and what can be done to stop it? To talk more about how men use violence to control women, I'm joined by Dr. Peter Adams. Kia ora, Peter. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Katrina. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How did you come to write Masculine Empire?
Well, the book was my attempt to try and communicate a lot of the work that I'd been involved with in stopping violence programs, working with men, and also some of the research we did, interviewing men about the justifications and the reasons why they chose to be violent to their partners. So it was an attempt to try and explain the broader side of what's happening, and in particular I focused on 5 men in a bar talking about women and how their conversations connected with what was happening in the home. So I was kind of relating 2 areas. One was the men together as men and how they think about women, and then what actually happens in the home place, and how men's attachment to being in charge in the home, to being the boss in the home, how that links with the way men talk to each other.
And that's really partly where the title comes from, isn't it? Because what you were saying in the book is that in our society, it's basically each individual man's job to keep his woman sort of under the thumb in the home and exert control, and that's kind of part of the requirement of being a man, or the masculine contract almost.
If you look at a man hitting their partner, that's quite an extraordinary act, and it's happening in a widespread way. So trying to make sense of that by just looking at individual men and their psychologies, I don't think gets you very far. I think it's the broader feed-ins, and one part of that is the way in which men traditionally have approached women, but it's also actively reinforced, particularly when men are by themselves, without women in earshot. And I've just noticed over the years how, particularly in male-only spaces, there's a reality there. There's a way of speaking, a way of thinking, which is reinforced and encouraged within that space. And I was trying to kind of capture some of that in the book.
Mm. And the other thing you say in the book is that men have colonised the inside of women's heads, you know, in the way that the colonials have colonised countries. Can you explain that?
Well, violent behaviour is only part of a spectrum of different types of activities that men use to control women. Controlling them by intimidation, by controlling finances. There's quite a range of ways. And I think the men being in charge, the intent is to keep that position of control in the home. And unlike an empire that's built around a central base, these are micro communities, these are micro spaces. The home becomes the territory that man needs to be in charge of. So, and that's achieved by claiming ownership of the way things are talked about or thought about within the home environment. So a lot of the behaviours around control, the use of surveillance, the use who has the last word, A lot of those behaviours are aimed at ensuring that the male perspective is dominant within that space and that a woman's is subjugated or secondary to that male perspective. And for a woman, often when that's been reinforced with violent and controlling behaviour, they become captured within that. They become lost within the perspective that the male is pushing forward. Often men talk about their violence more as, I don't think they think of it as controlling behaviour. They think of it as a educational process, that we're re-educating women into seeing how the world really does operate and ensuring that the natural order of things is reinforced and carries on.
And what do you think could be done to change some of this?
Well, a lot of progress has been made in terms of gender equity in the public space. Women are working in many more occupations than they used to. The conversations now are not non-sexist. But in those two more private spaces of men with men and in how things happen in the home, I wonder about the progress we've made in that. One of the things that hit me, I was involved with a research project interviewing young men, and I've been involved with this area for 30 years, and they were saying exactly the same things maybe young guys would say 30 years ago, that women are just as violent as men. She was asking for it, perhaps. You know, those same kind of viewpoints were still just as strong. I'm thinking, how come we've shifted so much in the public arena in terms of gender equity and moved so little in the private spaces? You know, why aren't we? Why isn't it reflected when men are together, say at a sports club or in a bar? Why isn't that changing? So I think one of the big challenges is to begin to make a difference in those spaces, particularly men on men, is finding ways of men to talk about being male that don't engage in the history of men being in charge, and also looking at exploring other possibilities of being male and men together that don't buy into that longer term men being naturally in charge perspective.
Is that quite hard for men, especially in New Zealand where we have a very macho culture? And I think also in the book, you know, the man that was displaying less of this empire behaviour, is he seen almost as a traitor if you don't uphold your end of the male contract?
I think we've got some particular challenges in New Zealand, and one of them is, I think, supported by government very strongly, and that's to look at violence against women as non-gendered, as degendered. And if you look at the documents that come out of government quarters, they often talk about family violence and domestic violence without locating it in a gendered way. And this is it's a bit embarrassing when you go overseas, because overseas there's a much more willingness to talk about gender-based violence and violence against women in many countries like Australia and South Africa and similar countries with similar histories to us. But for some reason there's a strong reluctance to recognise that masculinity or ways of being male has a lot to do with what's going on. So I think in New Zealand we have the history of masculine empire and male dominance that's there, and as it is in many other countries. But our ability to respond has been hampered by the way we kind of reduce violence down to individuals, and even these individuals that are non-gendered, that women can be just as violent as men. That kind of way of thinking and speaking is still incredibly strong in New Zealand, and I think that's where we've got to start fronting up in terms of, and particularly that men need to start fronting up to the broader supports for violence in our country.
A lot to do. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Now it's time for the Woman Power fails and wins. The Woman Power fail goes to the man who wrote in response to the Everyday Sexism project, quote, You experience sexism because women are inferior in every single way to men. The only reason you've been put on this planet is so we can f*** you. Please die. Close quotes. Our Woman Power win this week goes to 16-year-old young woman all over the world doing amazing things. New Zealand singer Lorde has not only taken the music charts by storm, she eloquently articulates feminist principles. Pakistani teenager Malala Yousafzai was almost killed by the Taliban, but continues her education and political campaigning. And New Zealand golfer Lydia Cole has just announced she's turning professional. All of them are only 16. Efforts to address this country's shocking toll of domestic violence are proving unsuccessful. Despite campaigns and advertising, the number of women assaulted by their partners continues to rise. What would happen if we pulled together as a country to eliminate domestic violence? To talk more about this, I'm joined by long-time campaigners Ruth Herbert and Jessica Trask. Kia ora, Ruth, welcome to the program.
Thank you, kia ora.
And kia ora, Jess, good to have you here.
Hello.
You and Ruth have set up a new consultancy and you're preparing a comprehensive report about what needs to be done to address domestic violence in New Zealand at the moment.
That's right. We've been working over the last couple of months to prepare a report, an action-orientated report with some evidence-based thoughts on where we might go from here in New Zealand.
And you're going to circulate that early next year. Is that the plan to government agencies and community groups?
Absolutely. We want to circulate it very, very widely and start a conversation about where to from here.
Because what we've been doing to reduce or even better eliminate domestic violence just isn't working, is it?
I think it's fair to say it's not working. There've been a lot of efforts. There are a lot of people day by day making huge efforts out at the coalface and in central government, but the problem is not going away. There are no indications we're making an impact yet.
What do we need to do you think?
Well, I think what we've done is there's been a lot of we tend to look for quick fixes. There's been a lot of good ideas. There's been quite a lot of what we would think of more as an ad hoc approach. What we think we need to do is to look at the whole issue. We need to develop a whole framework, and so that we're acting according to an overarching plan. This is a very complicated problem. We're not going to be able to fix it with good ideas and quick fixes. It's going to take generations, long-term sustainable funding, long-term strategies, everybody working together.
And how do you develop an overarching framework and what would that incorporate?
Well, between us and with others, we've been around the sector for a long time. We've read extensively over the years. So what we're trying to do in this report is to pull together everything that we see. A lot of it's what other countries have already tried and showed some success in. Some of it's what parts of New Zealand have done successfully. We think we need to focus a lot on what the actual research evidence internationally says. So we want to take one opportunity and put it all down in one place and then put it out for conversation, see if people agree or don't agree.
And what are some of the key points that you think we need to take up from overseas?
I think that what the evidence is telling us now is that we need to look at domestic violence and child abuse together. We cannot separate those. And we won't be successful if we do try and separate them. We have to take a joined-up system approach. We've got to see all of these, prevention and intervention, all of the services, all of the stages, as joined up as one system. We've got to get a shared understanding. We don't have that at the moment. We've got to bust the myths. That involves good, consistent training, so everybody's looking at the issue through the same lens. And we've got to keep looking at evidence. It's new evidence comes out all the time.
And is it almost that perhaps the community needs to be the main driver of this? Because you mentioned before that we take an ad hoc approach, and I think part of the problem we have is that in New Zealand we have 3 yearly election cycles, and so governments do actually take very short-term approaches. I mean, if you're in government and you just want to get re-elected, there's really very little incentive to be looking at 20 years out, is there?
That's right. I think you're absolutely right. There's a bit of a conflict, if you like, between an issue like domestic violence and child abuse in our 3-year election cycle, because not only do we have this short cycle, but our politicians look for results. So they look for things, strategies, actions, initiatives that are going to give them some sign that things are working before the next election. And I think that's been to our detriment. And I think this can't be a party political issue. We all, communities, central policy agencies, all political parties have to work together.
And if a pretty comprehensive plan or blueprints drawn up, could you then perhaps trial in a couple of different local areas, really on the ground to see what specific strategies worked and then hope to roll them out nationwide if they were successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely the change that we need to see is going to be first modelled in communities. I think that they're best placed, and there's a real desire and a kind of hunger to get it right. And in lieu of a really comprehensive, robust, nationally led approach, they've been doing the best they can with what they have. And yeah, there's a great desire to do better, and we're certainly in conversation with a lot of communities who certainly have that desire to take things to the next level, and to really know, to evaluate what they're doing, and to really truly know that what they're doing is having the impact that they think it is.
Realistically, to tackle this problem properly, wouldn't that involve a large input of resources? And I mean, that's one thing we're not prepared to do. As Ruth says, we're just looking for quick fixes. And I mean, I particularly think of all the women and children that I deal with, and there's just no financial resources put into them being safely kept away from the violent partner. And I mean, it's hard enough to get away and stay away anyway, and then just financially, they're more or less forced to go back.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the question about resource is a secondary one, but a very important one. But I think that at the moment we're spending hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars on interventions and programs and prevention campaigns that we're really not sure what the impact of that is. So I think that potentially the answer isn't in having more money, because what we're doing, we don't know enough about what we're doing at the moment to be sure we're doing it right. So we might be we might better spend the money we're already investing in a much more wise way and have a greater impact.
And also, we often don't take into account how much it's costing us in days off work, and women not being able to be in the workforce, and all the moving around as well.
That's huge.
Yeah, isn't one of the problems that we've got that we don't really listen or take account of what victims say?
Absolutely. I think we've not been great at that in New Zealand. It's certainly a lot of other countries in the world have done a lot of the work there is integrally connected to survivor voices and experiences, which kind of allows it to keep that integrity and ensure it's on the right track.
I mean, I know in my work, women, especially making allegations of family violence, they're just so often disbelieved, and the thing is, she's just a vindictive woman trying to get back at her ex-partner. I mean, and I think another thing I can think of in the family court, when women apply for protection orders and they're not granted, I just don't think judges realise that not only is the order not granted, but that's just such a knockback to the woman about, it's just telling her the system is going to give her no help.
I think that's a really important point, and I think one thing that we must start doing in New Zealand is put the victims, the survivors, which is almost always women and children, at the centre of everything, and believe their lived experience. And I think that the life that victims of domestic violence and child abuse live is not well understood by others,
No.
and it is very easy to minimise it. And we see a lot of that. And until we do that, until we have an understanding of our judges, our lawyers, our doctors, our school teachers, as well as our community workers, that see what's happening and understand the lived experience. One of the examples I often think of is we've seen people live through the earthquakes in Christchurch and gone, oh, the dreadful outcomes for people who've suffered that trauma for 2 years of not knowing when the next earthquake's going to hit. Very, very similar to living in a domestic violence, family violence situation, except some people, some women and children live there for 20, 30 years with the same levels of trauma, of uncertainty, of fear. And I think we need to give as much attention to the victims of family violence as we have to the victims of the earthquake.
Are you optimistic that we can make some progress in addressing domestic violence?
Absolutely. Absolutely, incredibly optimistic. That's why we stay committed to what we're doing. I think that the information is there, the ways of working are there, we've got committed people, we've got to pull all that together, and I believe if we do that and we have a shared will, we can make huge inroads. We can lead the world without really reinventing this. It's there at our fingertips, we just need to grab it.
Thanks, Ruth. Thank you, Jess. Now it's time for News of the Week. 1 in 3 people in the Australian state of Victoria witnessed sexism and discrimination against women in the past 12 months, but fewer than half said or did anything to stop it, according to a Vic Health report. The document, called More Than Ready, said that many people wanted to intervene but did not know how to. A new initiative in Ballarat called Act at Work is now helping organisations challenge sexism, discrimination and violence against women. College students dressed up as pregnant women held up a banner and sang in front of an office building in Beijing to protest employers' discrimination against pregnant employees, including one who was fired by her employer. 7 women who were sexually assaulted while they were students at the University of Connecticut have filed a federal discrimination complaint against the school. Their attorney said that the university failed to respond appropriately. UN Women has highlighted the extent of sexism globally by using suggested search terms from Google's autocomplete feature to highlight gender inequality. For example, type in the words "women need to" and autocomplete adds "be put in their place," "know their place," "be controlled" and "be disciplined." New Zealand Man Booker Prize winner Eleanor Catton has given an interview to The Guardian in which she discusses sexism in the literary field. You can read the interview online. The impoverished relatives of a murdered 16-year-old girl are fighting the wealthy family of an MP in Afghan courts in a case that is testing efforts to bring the country's elite within reach of the law. Shakila, whose last name is unknown, was shot dead in 2012. The MP is accused of murdering her. Her family believes that she was also raped. 3 people convicted of torturing a child bride were recently freed by an appeal court, fueling fears that the position of women in Afghanistan is going backwards. A debate about the extent of sexism in the scientific world has been sparked by exchanges in the science blogosphere and the resignation of a Scientific American editor following sexual harassment. Check out theguardian.com Science Sexism blog, October 2013. The Feminist Majority Foundation is urging women to send letters to United States President Barack Obama, urging him to fulfill America's commitment to empower women and girls and ensure universal access by 2015 to reproductive health services, family planning and basic education. The cost would be $3 billion US, less than half of 1% of the American annual defence budget. Now it's time for the 5 action points from this week's episode. Provide proper funding so women and children can permanently escape violent relationships. Intervene at the outset of violence and abuse instead of dismissing initial violence as trivial. Replace New Zealand's macho culture with one that values women. Recognise that domestic violence is used systematically by men across society to control women and is not an individual issue. Produce an action plan to abolish domestic violence. Thanks for watching. Join us next week when we'll talk about reproductive rights. How much control do women have over our own bodies? We'll also be joined by star sportswoman Louisa Wall, who represented New Zealand in both netball and rugby, to talk about sexism in sport. Thanks for watching. Ka kite anō.